This is a brief examination of the Greater Invoking Ritual of the Pentagram, GIRP. Besides the technique and its uses, I'll share some personal reflections, such as when it will be appropriate to add it to your practice. As advocated in books on Thelema, GIRP is the technique to learn after LRP or the Lesser Pentagram Ritual. In a nutshell, GIRP is a much simplified Supreme Invoking Ritual of the Pentagram SRP, a thorough examination of which you can watch on this channel. Also starting and ending with a Qabalistic cross, GIRP can be used for both practical and mystical work. Though following the same structure, GIRP doesn't include sigils and zodiac signs like SRP, it is also purely Hebrew according to most sources. Nevertheless, some consider it essential since engaging deeper aspects of the elemental universe and preparing for rites like SRP and OBW. Depending on who you ask, and like Crowley's Liber Vel Reguli, those are sometimes referred to as subtop or modified versions of GIRP, lesser, greater, supreme. As mentioned in my SRP video, greater or supreme doesn't mean cooler or somewhat more special. It translates into specific or particular, whereas lesser is general and used for unimportant invocations as found in the Golden Dawn. It isn't one over the other, but utilizing both as inseparable segments of the same system, or if you prefer, the essential tools in your toolkit for building thought forms. Attuning the field of operation. The lesser ritual set the space, casting a magical circle by establishing a field of operation, as discussed in my two-part series on the subject. The greater and supreme rituals attune that space to a specific force or current, so the appropriate conjurations can be performed and a charge of intent delivered. Like SRP, GIRP is commonly used for working with one of the elemental kings, Jinn, Parauda, Nixa and Gop. Also for consecrating weapons and other objects such as attuning your daily life to a specific force. Yet unlike SRP, it cannot be used for working with the names of the tablets, like for instance the seniors at each center. Also like SRP, GIRP has 5 variations or forms. 4 corresponds to the paths of the elements, whereas the 5th is to Malkut, as is the 4 elements version. Identical to the planets, the elements also attribute to paths and Sephiroth. The only difference is that while the planets have individual spheres, the elements kinda share Malkut, the 10th Sephira encompassing the physical reality. Components. Like SRP, GIRP repeats the same combinations of divine names, god forms and pentagrams in all 4 quarters, yet it is usually recommended to begin with the Malkut version as it's more balanced. According to Scott Stenwick, the Malkut version can also be used for obtaining the vision of your AGA, as it's similar to Liber Vel Reguli, which Crowley recommended for that. Directions. Depending on your LRP and whole pentagram formula, the Malkut version of GIRP either uses the traditional winds model or most often swaps out the places of fire and air, placing the elements based on their density, as shown in my Circles of Magic videos and Jeff Rhodes's Hermetic Kabbalah. Either way, GIRP begins in the east, going clockwise, and all its elemental variations remain the same no matter the model you use. Spirit Pentagrams. Since spirit is both active and passive, the Golden Dawn and Thelema use active and passive spirit pentagrams, and some of their intricacies are discussed in my videos on SRP, the fields of operation, and Circles of Magic. Generally, spirit or quintessence isn't an element, it rather expresses itself through the element's order or equilibration, and this is why spirit invoking pentagrams are also called equilibrating, active and passive. Starting at the lower right angle, the equilibrating or spirit active pentagram is traced in bright violet. It animates from fire to air, water and earth following the density principle. Commencing at the lower left ray, the equilibrating passive spirit pentagram is dark violet and animates from earth to water, air and fire, also expressing the density principle. Spirit pentagrams names. While SRP keeps those for its spirit spokeswheel, GIRP employs Ehe and Agua for the active and passive pentagrams, meaning I am and You are mighty forever Adonai or My Word, which is basically your AGA. These names are vibrated simultaneously while the stars are traced. Spirit pentagrams, great signs and god forms. Completing each spirit pentagram is followed by the appropriate great signs. According to most sources, that's rending or opening the veil. According to others, the LVX signs or the LVX signs preceded by rending the veil. And according to third, all or some combination of that follows the sign of the Emperor. Symbols and living beings. When charged, symbols become living beings. Considering that, you figure out what combination does that best. Since opening the elemental universes, doesn't it make more sense to open and not close the veil as shown in some books for the passive spirit pentagrams? Let me know what you think of that. Otherwise, I suggest opening for invoking and closing for banishing as Scott Stanwyck and the Ciceros recommend. After all, what invoking really is attuning or opening yourself to something, and banishing is the opposite of that. Elements. Besides the density principle, Golden Dawn and Thelemic pentagrams follow the rule of invoke toward and banish from the point where the element is attributed. Traced in bright red, the far invoking pentagram commences at the spirit or topmost ray going clockwise. The one of air is bright yellow, proceeding counterclockwise from the upper left. The water invoking pentagram is boomerang, continuing clockwise from the upper right. Lastly, the earth invoking pentagram is dark green or black and starts from spirit going counterclockwise like in LRP. Air and water. Some people get perplexed as the air invoking pentagram resembles the water banishing pentagram due to sharing the same direction. You can avoid such confusions by associating appropriate colors, god names, and quarters of the circle. Qabalistic Worlds. Like SIRP, GIRP mainly targets the formative or Yetzirah world, and as mentioned in my SIRP video, you can think of that as the scaffold above or beyond our world of action, which is a Saya, or even as the front-end code making up the pages or websites that are your life. According to some sources, and depending on which diagram you consider, the effects of GIRP and SIRP can be felt in the lower aspects of the world of ideas, Briah. The reason is the worlds of power these rites employ with their elemental pentagrams. Like those of the spirit pentagrams, these names are vibrated in unison while the pentagram is traced. For fire, that is Elohim, which is shortened for Elohim Gibur, the name of the fiery Gibura, the sphere of Mars. For air, it is Yehovah or Yod-Heh Vav-Heh for spellers, coming from Yehovah Elovadat or Yod-Heh Vav-Heh Elovadat, the name associated with the sphere of the sun, Tiferet. Water associates with El, which is the name of Hesed, the sphere of Jupiter, and earth does that with Adonai, which is shortened for Adonai Haaretz, the name of Malkut and the physical reality. Yetzirah and Briah. Whether GIRP and SIRP have that much of an impact might be debatable, as some sources consider Briah to comprise Hesed, Geburah and Tiferet, others Binah, Hesed and Geburah, and third only Binah, as found in Thelemic books. Elements and god forms. After completing an elemental pentagram, you assume the appropriate god form. For fire, that is the sign of Philosophus, or 4=7, the god form of the goddess Tumishnit. For air is the one of Theoricus, or 2=9, the god form of Shu supporting the sky. For water, it is the sign of Practicus, or 3=8, the god form of the goddess Aramot. And for earth, it is 1=10, or Set fighting. Now, depending on who you ask, each of these is given as it is, or it follows the sign of the Emperor from LRP. Archangels. Entirely mimicking the structure of LRP, some sources suggest finishing GIRP by conjuring the Archangels. Others insist on calling only the force you'll be working with. Calling the Archangels may make a little sense as you already did that when setting the space, but supposedly you can think of it as representing the four aspects of the force you'll be working with. Performance. Far quadrant. Trace an equilibrating active spirit pentagram vibrating AHA. Open the veil and give the LVX signs or precede that with the sign of the Emperor. Trace an invoking far pentagram vibrating Elohim. Assume the god form of 4=7 or precede that with the sign of the Emperor. Air quadrant. Trace an equilibrating active spirit pentagram vibrating AHA. Open the veil, give the LVX signs or precede that with the sign of the Emperor. Trace an invoking air pentagram vibrating Yehovah or Yod-Heh Vav-Heh. Assume the god form of 2=9 or do that after using the sign of the Emperor. Water quadrant. Trace an equilibrating passive spirit pentagram vibrating Agua. Open the veil, give the LVX signs or precede that with the sign of the Emperor. Trace an invoking water pentagram vibrating El or Aleph El El. Assume the god form of 3=8 or precede that with the sign of the Emperor. Earth quadrant. Trace an equilibrating passive spirit pentagram vibrating Agua. Open the veil, give the LVX signs, or do that after the sign of the Emperor. Trace an invoking earth pentagram vibrating Adonai. Assume the god form of 1=10 or precede that with the sign of Horus. Reflections, greater or supreme. According to most sources, GIRP is Crowley's simplified or more Thelemic version of SIRP. On the contrary, the Ciceros Golden Dawn Magick gives a different definition. Quote, "There's another pentagram ritual beside the lesser and supreme, known as the greater ritual of the pentagram GIRP, that includes both invoking and banishing forms. It essentially is the same as the Supreme Ritual, but instead of using both Hebrew and Enochian divine names in tracing of the pentagrams, it employs just one or the other. However, the Supreme Ritual is more commonly used because it aligns the magician with a broad range of Golden Dawn magic and expresses a more comprehensive practice. Unquote. Different people, different preferences. Minding that magic is subjective, different people prefer GIRP over SRP and vice versa. In contrast, others say they are virtually the same since working with the elements similarly. Since I never used the Enochian-only version of the technique, I cannot speak of that. Comparing the standard All Hebrew GIRP with SRP, they are vastly different in the degree to which they produce a particular result. Given that, my subjective opinion remains that SRP is pretty unmatched for the power it exerts. It is like comparing a base and a fully spec'd MacBook Pros for editing or an entry-level and top-tier cinema cameras. In each scenario they kinda do the same, yet it's really how they do it and the capabilities each offers. Creativity. According to Rev Jeff Rhodes, quote, "This ritual, GIRP, invokes a great presence of divine power in the form of the elements plus spirit. It can be used anytime you require a greater amount of creative power." Unquote. While I wholeheartedly agree with that, I don't really think it's on par with SRP, and I consider myself a creativity junkie. So who is GIRP for? In my humble opinion, GIRP is excellent for anyone stuck in the often recommended LBRP-LBRH middle pillar sequence. I suggest replacing the first two with an invoking or operant field and adding GIRP. I also think it's ideal for anyone who for some reason doesn't want to mess with Enochian or Golden Dawn Enochian per se. As mentioned, GIRP is considered the most basic version of OBW and SRP, and some scholars recommend it daily to obtain the vision of the HJ. On the other hand, Rigardi advocated OBW daily for reaching 5 = 6. Given that doing GIRP daily might be some people's humble beginnings of that process, but all this is just my subjective opinion. I wonder what is yours. Feel free to let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, like this video if it provides value, subscribe for more content like this, check my other works and books, especially the PDFs I made on the fields of operation and SIRP, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for your time.